The bearings were still warm. That was the first sign. A yard worker in Camden, New Jersey, pressed his bare hand against the journal box on car number 7 and pulled it back fast. Hot metal. The kind of heat that meant something was already wrong inside. The Congressional Limited was about to leave for New York. 541 passengers were on board. It was Labor Day, 1943. The worker reported the heat. Mechanics checked the box. They said the lubrication was fine. The train left the station. 37 miles later, the axle snapped in two at 56 miles per hour. The signal gantry beside the tracks, a steel frame the railroad had built to hold switching equipment, sliced through the dining car lengthwise, cutting it in half. 79 people were killed. 117 were injured. The Interstate Commerce Commission spent months investigating the failure. They found the axle had reached an estimated 900 degrees Fahrenheit. They never established why. There are 7 levels of locomotive failure. The Congressional Limited was Level 2. Level 2 was survivable for some. 6 and 7 do not leave investigators much to investigate. Subscribe to American Iron Works if you want to understand what American railroads actually built and what it cost them when those machines came apart. The ladder starts at something most railroad workers had a word for: a hot box. A hot box is what happens when the bearings on a train axle overheat from friction. Bearings are the components that allow the axle to spin inside its housing. They need lubrication. In the era of journal bearings, which American railroads used from the 1830s through the mid-20th century, that lubrication was oil-soaked cotton. Packing stuffed into an iron box around the axle end. When the oil leaked or dried out, friction built. The bearing reached 70 degrees Celsius above ambient air temperature. At that point, it had already failed. Within half a mile of continued travel, bearing temperature jumped to 300 degrees above ambient. The bearing melted. It fell off the axle. The wheel came off next. The truck, the wheeled frame beneath the car, dropped to the ground, uncoupling the car from everything in front of it. Everything behind that car was still moving at full speed. The cars behind collapsed into each other in what engineers called an accordion-pattern. Railroads employed yard workers specifically to walk beside passing trains and watch for the smoke that meant a hot box was developing. The entire job existed because the failure was common enough to require surveillance. Modern roller bearings have largely eliminated the classical hot box. They fail in a different way. When a roller bearing fails, it produces less warning smoke. The failure signature is smaller. By the time it registers on a trackside detector, it is farther along the progression toward the wheel coming off than the old friction bearing would have been at the same detection point. The railroad solved the hot box. It created a quieter version of the same problem. 2 is where the hot box stops being a maintenance problem and becomes a structural one. The axle itself fractures. This is what happened to the Congressional Limited in 1943, and it is what happened on a railway outside Paris on May 8, 1842, when a locomotive axle snapped and turned a train carrying 600 Parisians home from a royal celebration into the deadliest railway accident in the world at that time. 55 to 200 people died in the 1842 Versailles crash, depending on which records you trust. The doors of the passenger carriages had been locked from the outside. It was standard practice at the time to prevent fare evasion. The passengers who survived the derailment could not get out of the burning cars. The Versailles accident is not a footnote. It is where the science of metal fatigue began. 2 engineers working independently in the decade after the crash developed the first systematic frameworks for understanding how a steel axle develops microscopic cracks under cyclic loading, the repeated stress of every wheel rotation, and how those cracks grow, invisibly, until the axle fails without warning. August Wohler spent 14 years running controlled experiments on axle steel from 1856 to 1870 to produce data that still forms the foundation of fatigue engineering. He was responding to a specific train crash in France. The Congressional Limited axle reached 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ICC found no cause. The mechanics said the lubrication was fine. Nobody has ever explained how a properly lubricated bearing on a new passenger train car reached 900 degrees on a 4-hour run from Washington to New York. Level 2 has a documented, named event and an open investigation file. 3 is subtler. The train stays on the tracks. The locomotive stays attached to the cars. A single component in the coupling system fails. The coupling knuckle, the interlocking steel piece at the end of each car that joins it to the next, breaks. One car separates from the train. At speed, that separation creates an instant pressure differential in the air brake system. The emergency brakes fire on both sections. The front of the train stops. The rear of the train stops. When the separated car is carrying a hazardous cargo, the consequences of it sitting alone on a mainline track, out of sequence, depend entirely on what is in it and who reaches it first. The United States Patent Office records document approximately 100,000 coupler knuckle failures per year. That is 275 separations every day. Minor failures happen in yards, at low speed, with crews present. The ones that occur at line speed, in the dark, are the ones that get investigated. On September 26, 2021, a Canadian national train in Saint-Hilaire, New Brunswick, lost a car when a cross key, a flat T-shaped metal part inside the coupler draft gear, shattered. The cross key had been in service for 4 years. The Transportation Safety Board found it had developed fatigue cracks during that time and that the design of the specific cross key had likely contributed to those cracks forming. 21 cars derailed. 8 were carrying hazardous materials. CN inspected 604 cars with the same manufacturer and draft gear design after the incident. Level 3 is a geometry problem. The solution to one kind of failure creates the conditions for another. 4 requires the train to be moving and the crew to not be on it. A runaway. On May 15, 2001, a CSX transportation yard engineer in Walbridge, Ohio, stepped off a slow-moving locomotive to correct a misaligned switch. He believed he had properly set the locomotive's dynamic braking system before stepping off. He had not. CSX Locomotive 8888, an EMD SD40-2 pulling 47 cars, 2 of them loaded with thousands of gallons of molten phenol, accelerated out of the yard and onto the main line. The locomotive ran south through northwestern Ohio for 66 miles, unattended, for just under 2 hours. Police officers attempted to stop it by shooting at the fuel cutoff button. 3 rounds hit the fuel cap instead. The fuel cutoff button on that locomotive required several seconds of sustained pressure to activate. A bullet could not do it. A portable derailing device placed on the tracks ahead of the train was thrown off the rails by the force of 8888 passing over it. The locomotive reached speeds of 53 miles per hour. It was finally stopped when a second locomotive caught it from behind, coupled to the rear car, and applied dynamic brakes until the speed dropped to 11 miles per hour. At that point, CSX trainmaster John Hosfeld boarded the still-moving train on foot and deactivated the engine manually. Every brake block on locomotive 8888 had been destroyed by the heat of 2 hours of constant friction. The name of the engineer who left the cab was never made public. 12 years later, on July 6, 2013, an unattended train of 73 cars carrying Bakken Formation crude oil rolled down a 1.2% grade from the town of Nantes, Quebec, and entered the downtown of Lac-Mégantic at 104.6 kilometers per hour. The locomotive had reported engine faults 2 days before the disaster. The maintenance facility decided the faults were not severe enough to pull it from service. When a fire on the locomotive caused firefighters to shut down the engine, the pneumatic brake system lost pressure. The parking brakes could not hold the grade. The train began to roll. It traveled 11 kilometers before it derailed. The explosion that followed had a blast radius of 1 kilometer. 47 people were killed. More than 30 buildings in Lac-Mégantic's downtown were destroyed. All but 3 of the 39 remaining buildings were demolished afterward due to petroleum contamination of the site. The Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway went bankrupt. Level 4 requires an unoccupied cab and a grade. Both are features of normal railroad operations. Which of these failures have you heard of before, and which ones were new to you? Subscribe to American Iron Works. The rest of this ladder is where the numbers stop making sense. 5 is what happens when the machine turns on the people running it. A steam locomotive boiler is a pressure vessel. A firebox burns coal or oil at approximately 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit inside a steel chamber. Water circulates around the chamber at high pressure, absorbing heat and turning to steam. The ceiling of the firebox is called the crown sheet. It must remain covered with water at all times. When the water level drops below the crown sheet, the firebox heat is no longer absorbed by circulating water. The steel reaches 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its tensile strength. The crown sheet, still under full boiler pressure, tears away from its supporting bolts. This happens in tenths of a second. The 2,500 gallons of water in the boiler, superheated to 386 degrees Fahrenheit at 200 pounds per square inch, have nowhere to go. They all flash to steam simultaneously. On May 12, 1948, Chesapeake and Ohio T-1 locomotive number 3020 exploded near Chillicothe, Ohio. The Interstate Commerce Commission investigation confirmed the cause: overheating of the crown sheet due to low water. The engineer, the fireman, and the brakeman were all killed by scalding water. On June 16, 1995, the crown sheet of Gettysburg Passenger Service's steam locomotive number 1278 failed while pulling an excursion train near Gardners, Pennsylvania. The explosion blasted steam through the firebox door and into the cab. The engineer received third-degree burns over 65% of his body. He was airlifted to a burn center outside Philadelphia. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated. They found the boiler had not been properly maintained and that some repairs had been performed incorrectly. The probable cause, the National Transportation Safety Board wrote, was management's failure to ensure the crew was trained. The specific knowledge required to operate a steam locomotive had been disappearing from American railroads for a generation by 1995. The National Transportation Safety Board identified this as a systemic problem, not an isolated one. There are approximately 150 steam locomotives still operating in the United States. The agency issued 7 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration. 6 removes the structure that contained the energy. A steam locomotive operating at 350 pounds per square inch holds the energy equivalent of approximately 1,200 kilograms of TNT in its water supply. That figure is a straightforward calculation. The specific enthalpy difference between superheated water at 350 pounds per square inch and water at atmospheric pressure gives the energy available for rapid release. Multiply by the mass of water in the boiler. Convert to TNT equivalent. The number is not a metaphor. In 1912, a Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway employee tightened the adjusting screw on a locomotive's safety valve. The safety valve is the only engineered relief mechanism between the boiler pressure and failure. When the safety valve is blocked or disabled, boiler pressure has no path of escape until the vessel itself becomes the path. The Texas State Railroad Commission investigated the explosion that followed. They found the employee had no experience setting safety valves. The railroad had assigned him the task anyway. The boiler, housing thousands of gallons of superheated water under pressure, failed at a point beyond the design tolerance of the steel. Photographs from level 6 failures show locomotives reduced to a tangle of steel tubes splayed across the ground. The boiler is gone, the cab is gone, the frame remains. One account of the C&O T-1 disaster described the scene as looking like the machine had been detonated from the inside. 7 is the tier where nothing is recoverable. At 6, the machine is destroyed and the people near it are killed. At 7, the machine, the infrastructure it was running on, and the surrounding site are all destroyed at the same time, and the investigation that follows is conducted by recovery teams counting pieces. On December 29, 1876, the Pacific Express, a passenger train operated by the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway, was crossing a bridge over the Ashtabula River in northeastern Ohio. The bridge collapsed. All but the lead locomotive fell 80 feet into the river. The train's oil lanterns and coal heating stoves set the wooden cars on fire. Firefighters arrived at the scene. They did not extinguish the flames. 92 of approximately 160 passengers were killed. Some of the bodies were recovered as far as 22 miles downriver. The bridge investigation found the structure had been improperly designed. The chief engineer responsible for it, Amasa Stone, had overridden objections from a more experienced bridge builder during construction. He testified before the investigating committee. He died by suicide 4 years later. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway rebuilt the bridge. Trains were running again 24 hours after 92 people died. Subscribe to American Iron Works. 1 is a maintenance failure. 2 is a fatigue failure. 3 is a geometry failure. 4 is an operational failure. 5 is a training failure. 6 is an institutional failure. 7 is what happens when all 6 layers fail in the same second, in the same place, and the railroad reopens the line before the bodies are identified. Every level on this ladder has a documented cause, a named engineer who saw it developing, and an investigation report that was filed before the rails went back into service. The 24 hours it took to rebuild the Ashtabula Bridge is not an operational detail. It is the answer to a question the railroad industry never asked out loud. There are 7 levels. The ladder does not announce which one any given train is on. That is what every man who ever put his hand on a hot journal box already knew. What surprised you most about this ladder? That it starts with something as simple as a dry bearing, or that the last level was documented and rebuilt in 24 hours?